Okay, we should be live now. I think it's everything should be fine now.
Excellent.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm here with Talis. Is that how you say your name?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. So for those who don't know, me and Talis had a bit of an exchange over on Substack. Um, I think Talis wrote an argument or an article arguing against error theory
Sort
and
of.
subjectivism. Yeah, and
The
then
original.
yeah.
Sorry, you go. You go.
Oh, I was gonna say I wrote a response to that, and he wrote a response to me, and I wrote a response back. And now we're going to be talking about it on here. But what were you going to say?
Yeah, just the main point of the first article was basically because I'd listened to a live stream with another friend of mine, and basically he was like giving some arguments for different like against different anti-realist views, and one of the people he was talking to was saying how they might be a bit question begging. And that was sort of what I wanted to argue against. I say, hey, arguments of this sort, like, they might sort of seem question begging from the outset, but really, they're not problematically question begging. They look a lot like these other arguments, like arguments against the golden rule or arguments against like an absolutist deontology, where it's like always wrong to lie. But it seems like we can, have premises against those views that, seem to beg the question, but don't actually beg the question. So that's what I was sort of mainly trying to argue for in that article, as opposed to conclusively argue against error theory and subjectivism.
Okay, yeah. So like on the question begging front, I don't think we really have any disagreement there.
Yeah.
Um, so with arguments, like sometimes people will like to say an argument is question begging because like you'd only accept this argument if you already like rejected the position that it's arguing
Yeah.
against. Like the
Yeah.
thing is, lots of times people will advance views that they don't really realize the entailments of the position they're voicing.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
it's fine to have an argument against it that points out the entailments of it. Like an example of this would be, you know, if you have someone who says it's permissible to, kill animals for food because they have like a sufficiently low cognitive capacity, I think it's fine to like argue against that by saying like, oh, but that would entail that it's fine to kill like severely intellectually disabled humans with like equivalent cognitive capacities to animals, and that's wrong. So your argument doesn't work. I mean, I think that's a fine argument against it
Yeah.
because
Argument for
usually the
species
people who
overlap. Yeah.
say that sort of thing, I don't think have thought through the entailments. Now, you do have some people,
Of
especially
course.
some people
Of course. There always
online,
are.
some prominent streamers that will just say like, "Oh, yeah, it's okay then. It's okay to like commit a holocaust against intellectually disabled people." But usually people who say that sort of thing aren't thinking of that. They don't realize the entailments. So I think we are kind of in alignment on the
Yep.
question begging um, aspect of that. Now, I did think
Great
there
success.
there was some there were some other issues that I had with the arguments.
Yep. Yep.
So I mean, we can just start with the argument against error theory. Um,
Yep. Good.
so for those of you who aren't aware, I think the argument was something like P1, if error theory is true, then there is nothing wrong or right with genocide. P2,
Yep.
there is something wrong with genocide. Conclusion, therefore, error theory is false.
Yep. Spot on.
Now, so the way I am looking at this is, so when an error theorist says there's nothing wrong with genocide, what the error theorist is really saying there, like when they make that statement, the proposition they're really expressing when they say that, it is that there is no stance-independent, non-natural fact, non-natural moral fact that genocide is wrong. Because, like, on an error theorist view, like, error theorists endorse the same semantic thesis as, like, the non-naturalist. They
Yep,
think,
like
okay,
me. Yes.
moral statements refer to these stance-independent, non-natural facts. It's just that there are no such facts, so these statements that make reference to them are all false. So when an error theorist says
Sort of.
there's nothing wrong with genocide, what they really, the proposition they're expressing is that there's no stance-independent, non-natural moral fact that genocide is wrong. And so, okay, if we like look at it, what they mean when they say there is nothing wrong with genocide, and we like apply that to the argument that you presented against error theory, like it translates to P1. Now I know you like take issue with this
Yeah, I know.
translation, but
You're
I'm just
setting
going to
the ground.
explain for like
Setting the
people
groundwork.
who haven't kind of seen our whole back and forth. The translation would be P1, if error theory is true, there is no stance-independent, non-natural fact, non-natural moral fact that genocide is wrong. P2, there is a stance-independent, non-natural moral fact that genocide is wrong. Conclusion, therefore, error theory is false. Now, I know you objected to interpreting the argument in this way.
Yep.
You said, okay, it's not meant, the argument is not supposed to assume non-naturalism. The premises have nothing to do, they don't assume that the wrongness, it's wrong in a non-naturalist sense.
Well, sort of. As in, like, it would be, yeah. The way I'd sort of characterize it would be, if we have that as the premise, it's much narrower than the original premise. So if I was to give you like an analogy, it'd be something like this. So premise 1, if morality does not exist, then it is not wrong or right to steal from anyone. But suppose someone took that, sort of translated it to the following. Okay, premise 1, if morality does not exist, then it is not wrong or right to steal from anyone in Australia. Right? It's like they're different. One's like much broader, it's applying to everyone, but the second one's just like only people in Australia. So in that sense, that's the sort of issue I'm having, because the wrong or right in that consequent of the first premise against, or any argument from in the genocide argument against error theory, it does have that as like one version, but it also includes all the other meta-ethical views as well, which is why I think subjectivists can also use it.
Well, okay, so here's my my issue with it. So if it's, if it's not meant to be interpreted in like the kind of way that I described, where it explicitly is about just stance-independent, non-natural moral facts, then it seems to me that you run into kind of an equivocation issue, because when an error theorist says there is nothing wrong with genocide, what they mean by that, the proposition they're expressing when they make that statement, is there is no non-natural, stance-independent moral fact that genocide is wrong. And then you have this argument against error theory, saying if error theory is true, then there is nothing wrong with genocide. But when you like use the phrase there is nothing wrong with genocide, you're talking about something different than what the error theorist is talking about. You're using that in some other way than that there is no non-natural stance-independent moral fact that genocide is wrong. It seems like then, you're not really addressing what the error theorist is saying, because now you're equivocating on there is nothing wrong with genocide.
Yeah, so I actually have to disagree, of course. But basically, I'm not only saying that error theorists would say that there's nothing stands independently wrong or right with genocide in a non-naturalist sense, right? Because error theorists also reject every other meta-ethical view. Like, you can't be an error theorist and a moral subjectivist, or a moral realist and a moral subjectivist, or something like that, right? Sort of, they're not compatible with each other. And basically, the first premise, I think, read naturally, is sort of showing this larger commitment that error theory has against all these other meta-ethical views, which is why it says like, oh, there's nothing wrong or right with genocide, full stop, as opposed to, oh, there's nothing stands independently wrong or right with genocide in a non-naturalist sense. Because as I was sort of saying before, like that, whilst that is true, it is a different premise to the one I was referring to, which is why I think the narrowness is going to be a problem, as opposed to, because a narrow premise isn't necessarily bad, right? It's only if it's supposed to be broad, but then it's interpreted in a more narrow sense, because then that can affect the validity of an argument. Not always, but sometimes, because I think it's definitely going to affect the validity if this equivocation charge goes through. Because yeah, if the first premise is actually just talking about these stance independent non-natural facts, but the second premise is just, oh, whatever meta-ethical view you want, if you're a subjectivist or expressivist or something like that, it's like, yeah, that would be equivocation. But luckily, that's not what's going on.
Well, let me ask you a question. So
Well, means
the way I use moral language, I use it like in a subjectivist way. So if I were to say something like buying animal products is wrong, what I would mean by that statement is something like I disapprove of buying animal products. Do you think an error theorist is committed to saying that I say something false when I claim that buying animal products is wrong?
Yeah, so this gets a little tricky, right? Because on the one hand, the error theorist will say all moral claims are going to be false. They're systematically false, right? Which is why they'd also say like things like subjectivism is not true if error theory is true, right? But on the other hand, they're also not saying that, if you say, okay, say like buying animal products is wrong, which I agree with, by the way, they're going to say, yeah, what you've said is mistaken, but they're not denying that, you don't have a preference against like people doing that, right? They're treating those things as two different things.
So, I mean, I guess this is because I think.
We can it might be easier if we talk about like your bat analogy and the God in the courthouse
Okay.
example in your article, because I think that might make it a bit
Okay, yeah. So in the article
clearer.
that I describe, I give this like analogy. I think it's something like Charlie says,
Yeah.
I have a bat in my house. And then Tasha replies, no, there's no bat in your house. You don't have any bat in your house. Because there's no like winged like animal,
Yeah.
nocturnal animal flying around in your house. And then, but the issue is like when Charlie said he had a bat in his house, he wasn't talking about the animal. He was talking
Yeah.
about a
Baseball
baseball
bat.
bat.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me like Pasha is like replying. Her reply to him is not at all like actually addressing what Charlie is talking about, because when she says there's no bat in your house, she's talking about some completely other sense of the term like bat. And that seems to me like what you're doing with your argument against error theory. Like you're talking about some completely different sense of the term wrong than the error theorist is talking about.
Yeah. Good. So basically, the move I'd make is just say that's not like relevantly analogous in the way I'm sort of concerned with. Because I think for Tasha, so the person who's saying like oh, Charlie says something false. When Charlie says like, oh, there's a bat in my house. And Tasha says, oh, that's not true. There's no winged animal in your house. I think for it to be properly analogous to Tasha being like an aero theorist, Tasha would also have to believe that the only sorts of bats that exist are winged animals. And then when Charlie comes around, he says like, oh, actually, I've got this baseball bat here. She's like, well, that's not a bat. It's like bats are only these winged mammals, because that's going to be analogous to the aero theorist saying like, morality is not your feelings. Morality is not our expressions. Morality is this stance, independent, non-natural stuff. It's nothing else, basically. It's,
Well,
I
like,
guess, if you're an aero theorist, you'd sort of be like someone sort of claiming there's a bat in their house. And then you go and you look around like there's no winged animal. Then they hold up like their coffee cup and they say, no, this is a bat. I'm like, that's not a bat. That's a coffee cup. Like when you said there was a bat in your house, you said something false, because bats can only be these winged animals as opposed to like this coffee cup or something like that. But at the same time, I do want to point out, Tasha wouldn't be saying, oh, therefore there's no coffee cup in your house, or therefore there's no baseball bat in your house. They're just saying like, that's just not what a bat is. And so there are no bats in your house. And therefore
okay.
Charlie said something false.
Yeah, so with the analogy you gave just now, which is like, okay, he says there's a bat in his house, but like what, he's talking about like a coffee cup or something. And then Tasha replies, no, there's no like bat in your house.
Yeah, because bats
But
can
you
only
have
be
a
this
coffee
winged
cup
animal. Yeah.
in your cup. You have a coffee cup in your house, but you don't have a bat, so your statement is false.
Because like he calls it a bat or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. Okay, so we might have some like this might be the real crux of the kind of disagreement here, because I think when you have a scenario like that, um, I think like if Tasha were to reply like that, like she would just be equivocating on bat. If when Charlie says bat, what he means by bat really is he just means to refer to a coffee cup, then the statement he's expressing there, the proposition he's expressing when he says there's a bat, is just the same proposition as there is a coffee cup. And so what he's saying is correct. And when Tasha says what he's saying is false, she's just equivocating on bat.
No, I have to disagree, because for it to be analogous, right? Because the moral error theorist says all moral claims are mistaken, like they're all false. Hence, we're all in error when we make moral claims. Hence, error theory. And then for this bat analogy to go through, Tasha has to be like the only sort of bat, like what's the best way to put it? Every like bat claim is false, because the only things that could be bats are these winged animals, and that's it. And so when Charlie's making these bat claims, he'd have to be making these claims about this winged animal. Since that's not what's going on, is a deep mistake. Even if he means something else, which might actually be helpful to go to your God example as well, because I feel this is specifically where it sort of goes to as well.
That. So in my article, in my latest response article to you, I talk about this analogy I have where, like, let's say someone is an atheist. And so this atheist says, all statements about God, excluding stuff like, oh, God doesn't exist or God does not, like, whatever, all statements that assume the existence of God, because God doesn't exist, any of those statements are false. So if someone says something like, if two people have an argument, God disapproves of homosexuality, and another person, no, he's okay with it. They're both saying something false because the thing they're talking about just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But like I point out in that article, like there are actual like human beings who have like the legal name God. And so there was this like Huffington Post story about this guy named God who he had to like have some like fight in court to like show like, no, like I this is my actual name, like to show that he actually exists. So if you make like if someone makes a statement like God had this like legal battle in court or something. And then when they say God there, they're talking about the human God. They're not talking about, this all good, all powerful, all knowing creator of the universe. They're talking about this human being. I don't think an atheist is going to be committed to saying, well, because that's a statement about
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
your claim is false. Like, I think what an atheist would say is, well, when I say like
Yeah.
all statements about God are false, what I really mean is like all statements about like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all
Yeah.
good creator
Yeah.
of the universe. So if you're using the word God in some other sense, your statement is not false. And so that's or it's not necessarily false. And so that's how like I think what's going on with the error theory case. Like when an error theorist says all moral statements are false, what they're really talking about is all statements which like assume the existence of these stance independent non-natural moral facts. Like I don't think if I come along to an error theorist and I say, oh, I think buying animal products is wrong, and they know that when I say buying animal products is wrong, they know that when I say that I really just mean I disapprove of buying animal products. I do not think the error theorist is going to be committed to saying that like what I just said is false.
But I think the important difference is that you take yourself to be making a moral claim when you say that, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But when someone like, someone says, oh, this man God is going to court, like they're not making a theistic claim, which the atheist would take problem with, right? They say like all theistic claims are false because there is no God. But just like if you're just referring to someone who just happens to be called God, that's not a theistic claim. But the subjectivist or anyone else who holds like a meta-ethical view, they claim to be making moral claims when they say like, oh, genocide's wrong, or we shouldn't buy animal products. Even if like you're a subjectivist, you're going to just cash that out in different terms, but you're still making a moral claim, or at least you're purporting to make a moral claim. And that's what the error theorist is going to take issue with. Because they say like, oh, all moral claims, like they're all false because they have to be this other thing. And so they would just accuse folks like subjectivists of just being confused about what morality is. Like, you're not really talking about morality when you make moral claims. You're just reporting your preferences and stuff like that. So that's what I think the relevant difference is here.
So, I mean, you're right. Like, okay, like I would consider that to be like a moral kind of judgment that I've just rendered by, saying buying animal products is wrong. But like, the thing is, when I use the term like moral, I am not using that term in the same way that the error theorist is using. Like when I talk about moral judgments, I am just using the entire like notion of a moral judgment, like operating on some completely like different notion than like what the error theorist is talking about. And so like if like I explain to the error theorist, no, like for me, like the way I use the term moral judgment, all I'm talking about are just like reports of my attitudes. It's like, well, then it's like there's nothing I've said there that's in any way false. It's like you say, like in the God example, okay, it's not like a theistic claim, but like let's say that like whoever made that statement, they just use the word theistic to say like any statements which assume that this human God exists are like theistic statements. It's like, is the atheist now like committed to saying what they said was false? Well, I don't think so, because when this other person uses the term like God or uses the term theistic, like they're just using that in completely different ways than the error theorist. Like that's not what the error, or not the error theorist, the atheist. That's not like what the atheist is talking about when they say that all theistic claims or all claims that assume God are false.
Well, remember, because the atheist believes all theistic claims are about the omnigod, right? As opposed to some dude called God. And so even if someone means something else, they're still saying something false, right?
Okay.
That's the issue. Because as I said, it's like if someone's, going back to the bad example, it's like Tasha's not going to say, oh yeah, there's no bat or coffee cup in your house, but there are no bats. And you say it's something false when you said there was a bat. Because bats can only be this thing, this winged animal. And so when you make moral claims, you're actually trying to represent like this moral reality, but there is no moral reality, which is why it's false. Because otherwise it's going to lead to some problems. Like it seems that error theory is not compatible with subjectivism, but under this guise, it seems it would be, because it'd just be like, oh, we can have preferences and also think that there aren't like these non-natural moral facts or something.
Well, okay, so I mean, I think maybe our understanding
like it's
of like error theory is a bit different. So like the way I understand error theory is, I take it to be like making some claim about ordinary moral discourse. Like when people, when in ordinary moral discourse, when like the typical person makes moral claims, what they're doing is they're really talking about some like non-natural stance, independent moral fact, and because those entities don't exist, like all these statements are false. But I don't interpret it as saying as like including within it that like, okay, like if there are kind of these like outlier cases where this kind of person who uses this language, like the term like immoral or something, in a way that's like out of accord with the ordinary usage of the term, like if they use it to mean this other thing, I don't interpret error theory as coming with this claim that, oh, that statement they make must be false.
It just matters if they take themselves to be making moral claims, because someone could just sort of use the words wrong or right, but not be making a moral claim, right? It's just they're just using the same like language that's not actually referring to the same thing.
Okay,
right?
I mean, this
so the error theorist wouldn't take problem with that. It's like if I called my child morally wrong, the error theorist is like, he doesn't exist. It's like, of course, that's not going to happen. It's just any moral claim. Anyone who takes themselves to be making moral claims, the error theorist is going to say they're mistaken.
Okay, well, I think we might have like an issue here. I mean, if we're I mean, look, if we're like interpreting the error theorist in that way, and I don't know if you share this view that like there are just right and wrong ways to use terms. Like I don't think that's the case. I think like in the case we were talking about earlier with the coffee cup, if someone like uses the term bat to talk about a coffee cup, I don't think they're like using the term wrong. I mean, unless by wrong you just mean like out of accord with standard usage of the term, in which like then okay, like it's wrong. But like I don't think they're saying something false. Like you can use the terms however you want. The proposition you're expressing is fixed by what you're intending to express.
Well, remember to have the analogy right, Tasha would have to believe that the only things that could be bats are these like winged animals. So when Charlie says, "There's a bat in my house," that just means, oh, there's this winged animal in my house. But there would be no animal in the house.
No, I mean, I think you get into like weird stuff with that. I mean, the way I would interpret it is like, okay, like this is how she uses the term bat to just like refer to this like winged animal. She thinks this is like I don't know, I guess you would call it like ordinary bat discourse. Like when ordinary people like use the term bat, they mean to talk about this like winged animal. When Charlie uses the term bat to talk about a coffee cup, um, he's using that term in like maybe in a wildly proprietary way that basically no one else would use it that way. Like, I don't think she would be committed to saying what he's saying is false. Just like in the error theorist case, like you could say it's kind of a wildly proprietary like notion of like moral or immoral or whatever the term is. Like basically, that's not what I'm talking about. That's basically not what anyone else is talking about. But like, I don't think the error theorist would have to say, oh, what you're saying is false. You're like affirming a false proposition.
I mean, do you think like error theory is compatible with like subjectivism?
Well, no, I don't think error theory is compatible with subjectivism, but that's because I take like error theory and subjectivism to both be like, they both include claims about ordinary moral discourse. So like when a error theorist says that like an error theorist says that ordinary moral discourse, when people make moral statements, they're talking about like stance independent non-natural moral facts, whereas a subjectivist says when ordinary people use moral statements, they're reporting their attitudes. So like I don't think they're compatible. Like, you can't have like both of those things be true at the same time. But like I don't think that means that an error theorist is committed to saying like if you have like this kind of like rare like outlier who happens to use moral language in a subjectivist way, that they're saying something false.
Well, what would you think of this sort of statement? So, error theory claims moral claims are systematically false. Moral subjectivists claim that some moral claims are true. Right? So, in that sense, would you say like they contradict each other? Like putting aside the claims about ordinary moral discourse, because that doesn't seem to be like a core component or like a necessary component you can sort of do without, I think, in some cases. But what would you sort of make of that statement? I can repeat it if you want.
Well, I mean, I think they're just talking about different things when they talk
That's what
about
I thought you might say. Because I'm assuming when you like with like the following sentence, moral error theory asserts that moral claims amount to claims about non-natural moral facts. Like you're going to interpret moral claims there as claims about non-natural moral facts, right?
Yeah.
But the issue then is that it trivializes the view to the point that everyone would accept it, because it would just amount to saying moral error theory asserts that claims about non-natural moral facts amount to claims about non-natural moral facts. It's like, well, of course.
Well, no, but I take it as like making a statement about, okay, like when people use the kind of when people use moral language, the typical person is talking about like stance independent non-natural moral facts, and that like someone who would use it in a different way, like in a subjectivist way, even though they're not saying anything false, they're using the language in a way that doesn't accord with typical use of the language.
But again, like the subjectivist still says they make moral claims, which is where the problem comes in. Because if the subjectivist just says like, actually, my view is not a meta-ethical view, I'm just saying what my preferences are. The other theorist is like, oh, fine. I don't think you're mistaken in what you're saying. You're just saying you like this thing or don't like this thing. But if you come into the house and say, oh, and I'm also making moral claims when I say this stuff, you're like, no, moral claims are claims about non-natural moral facts.
Well, I mean, I take the disagreement is what they say about ordinary moral discourse.
Not necessarily. because error theorists wouldn't say like some moral discourse, like what was I going to say? Yeah, I guess I just don't take the ordinary discourse like super duper seriously, because it's just like, oh, it's like, okay, fine, but it can also still be false and still be true.
Well, okay, so like the subjectivist, they would say.
Well, I suppose it does matter. Yeah, it does matter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so
It is
I take
about
it
like
they're
explaining the
making, yeah,
phenomenon of morality.
they're making like competing claims about like what like moral, okay, what these class of statements that use like these particular terms, like right, wrong, like immoral, moral, etc. Like when people typically make those statements, you know, they're referring to like whatever this, like the error theorist is going to say stance independent, non-natural moral facts. The subjectivist is going to say, uh, it refers to like descriptions of people's attitudes. So like they disagree on that. They have competing like views on that. And the error theorist, when they talk about like moral claims being all false, they're talking about like claims which assume the existence of stance independent, non-natural moral facts. I don't take it as there being anything that would like commit them to saying someone who happens to use the string of words, buying animal products is wrong to express the proposition.
Remember,
it has to be buying animal.
It has to be like a moral claim as well, as opposed to just the language of just the claim, which is like the example with God in the courthouse. Like, yeah, you can just use the word God, but that's not necessarily a theistic claim. So it has to be a moral claim. So,
well, like, yeah, but the subjectivist or the person who uses it in a subjectivist manner, like I could say, yeah, that's like a moral like claim that I just made. And it's like, does an error theorist have to think I'm saying something false when I say I made a moral claim? Because it's like if the error theorist asks me, well, what do you mean when you say like moral claim? I respond, oh, by that I just mean, a claim about my attitudes. And then it's like, well, okay, well, once the error theorist sees, okay, well, this is what he means when he says he made a moral claim. It's like, that's true. If moral claim means a claim about one's attitudes, then yeah, like he did make a moral claim, like he said something true, but like that's not, you can recognize that what I'm saying is true while simultaneously thinking, okay, this doesn't accord with ordinary usage of the term, and like I would not use the word moral to like mean that.
But the issue is like this would settle the error theorists from thinking some moral claims are true, which is just like that's just not their view.
Well, it depends on what you mean by moral claim.
But remember what I said, if you define moral claim in a specific way in accordance with each view, it trivializes the view. So like I think what you were saying about subjectivism would sort of amount to the following. It's like if subjectivism asserts that claims about what you care about are claims about what you care about. It's like, well, of course, everyone agrees with that, but that doesn't make me a subjectivist.
Okay, well, I mean, I think there's like an issue here. Like, if we're going with the interpretation of error theory and subjectivism, and I guess like these sorts of like metaphysical views, if that's how we're interpreting like the views, then like I just don't think any of the views really make sense. Like I don't see how you can, like if an error theorist says, okay, moral claims, they like mean this, they mean moral claims are all false. It's like, okay, because moral claims mean claims about like stance independent, non-natural moral fact. Like, how can you say I like? Are you saying they're like saying that there's some kind of like meaning to the terms that's like independent of how people actually like use the terms? So like even if I use the term immoral to like say I have a negative attitude towards it, that like what I'm saying is like still false somehow just because I used the word like immoral, like that to me I don't think makes sense.
Well, as I said before, it's not just using the word immoral, right? It has to be immoral, and you're also making a moral claim, which is where the error theorist is going to take issue.
Okay, well, what does moral claim mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's even necessary to define it here. I think all we really need to show is that if we sort of define it as each theory would have it, it trivializes the theory, makes it so that everyone who would, maybe almost everyone would accept it. So it's like take a claim like subjectivism is the view that moral claims are like about what our preferences are, something like that, something crude like that. Like that seems to be an interesting theory, right? In the sense of like you can talk about whether it's true, we can sort of argue about it. It's not just we just won't just accept it on face value. But if we sort of interpret moral claim there to mean what the subjectivist might mean in some other cases, it would just amount to like a trivial claim that says subjectivism is the view that like claims about what our preferences are report our preferences, which is just like, well, of course that's true. But if that's right, then they're not the same claim. And so moral claims there is not referring to just, claims about our preferences. It's more like whatever we take the phenomenon of morality to be, perhaps like pre-theoretically and stuff like that. Because there's this phenomenon of morality and we're trying to make sense of it with all these different theories. The error theory says like, there is this phenomenon, but it doesn't actually get at anything. We're actually just tricking ourselves. It's sort of like Santa Claus. It'd sort of be like, if Santa Claus existed, he would be this, this fat guy who delivers presents to everyone in the world on a certain night of the year. But we really just made him up, right? I suppose that could be like analogous to an error theorist saying like, if morality exists, it would be like this thing. But what we're really doing is we're just sort of, we have this sort of preferences and and that sort of informs what these quote unquote moral views are. But since they're actually just our preferences, that's not morality at all. We're in this error. So that's sort of where I'm getting at.
So under this interpretation of the views, I don't even know what to say about error theory or subjectivism then, because I don't even really I don't know what's being meant by moral claim there. I don't know what they're talking about.
Well, I know. Does that mean
moral claim?
I don't know. I think we can make moral claims without having a meta-ethical view, right? We don't have to be like, oh, this is what this means, or this is what wrong means.
Well, sure. If you mean I can understand moral claim as it's some sort of statement that I don't know, uses certain terms, okay, if someone says this is immoral, this is permissible, etc., those are moral claims, and then we can do and if you just mean that, then okay, I can understand that. But then what those mean, it's kind of empirical question about the psychologies of the people using those terms, what they mean. This thing, we're just going to if that's not what you're talking about, though, I'm not sure what one would be talking about.
Well, in any case, this is the reason why I think a broader conception of the first premise is accurate, as opposed to the narrow sense, which is just talking about stance independent non-natural facts. which is why I think it's basically like nothing wrong or right, genocide in like any and all senses, because that's what the error theorist is going to deny. If you're a subjectivist, you make a moral claim about certain things being wrong or right, they're going to say you're mistaken because morality is this other thing. Subjectivism is not the right metaethical view, such and such. And which is why a subjectivist can assert the second premise and still come out with the conclusion without equivocation.
Okay, well, I
But
mean,
if we want to move on, that's fine as well.
okay, I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I have an issue. I mean, I said this in my article with this broader like interpretation that you're giving. I don't. Where like wrong doesn't just like where like something is wrong with genocide, it doesn't just mean there's like a stance independent, non-natural moral fact that something is wrong with genocide. If that's not what it means, I'm not even really sure how to evaluate the truth value of the premises because I don't know what proposition they're expressing.
It's more like that's not all it means, would be the best way to put it. Sort of like how the claim, if morality does not exist, then it is not wrong or right to steal from anyone. But in comparison to this narrow claim, if morality does not exist, then it is not wrong or right to steal from anyone in Australia. It's like, yeah, like that second premise is included in the first one, but that's not all the first premise is saying. It refers to everyone as opposed to just everyone in Australia. And so in this sense, it's like, hey, if moral error theory is true, like no view about what's wrong, right is going to be correct. But one of those at least is right. So moral error theory is false. Because it can't account for this wrongness, however you want to account for that with genocide. Because if you want to say like, oh, someone's really, really into non-naturalism, and that's what they think the right view is, and they think it's absurd to reject the idea, they could use that if they wanted to. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm still not.
I'm not sure if we're getting anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that we're going to resolve this particular, like if error theory and subjectivism and all these meta-ethical views. I mean, so, okay, let me just get this right. Do you take like error theory and like subjectivism and like, other meta-ethical views, you take them to be making statements about like ordinary discourse that when like people invoke certain terms such as like immoral or moral, etc., that they're like, when they say that, they're intending to like refer to, in the case of error theory, stance independent, non-natural facts, or in the case of subjectivism, descriptions of their attitudes. Like, do you think one could be an error theorist or a subjectivist while like just making no claim about that at all?
No, I think I'd probably say, yeah, they'd have to make a claim about that if they're trying to explain the phenomenon of morality. Because it'd be kind of weird to say like, oh, like this is the right view about morality, but no one talks like this. It's like, well, unless there's some massive like confusion going on, it's like maybe, but in that sense,
Okay,
it's like,
well, let me ask you this. So
probably
let's
yeah,
just take some issue, I don't know, something that you think is morally wrong, and whatever it is, and like let's say I say, okay, whatever that action is, I then say that action is permissible or that action is morally right, and when I say that, I mean that I approve of that action. Do you think I'm saying something false when I say that?
When you say that some action is permissible, like what act are you talking about?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know. Like, you're normative. Like, let's just say someone.
I'm a vegan, so just put it maybe like put it a vegan way.
Okay, yeah. Well, I didn't want to do that because I'm also vegan, but okay, it doesn't really matter. Like, let's just say someone says, eating meat is I don't know, eating meat is morally right, and by that they just mean
Boo.
I approve of eating meat. Do you think they are saying something false when they make that statement?
Yes, and they're also confused
Okay, why are they confused?
because they're making a moral claim, right? That eating meat is like right, which is not right. It's bad. Don't eat meat.
Okay,
And they're
but
also confused because morality isn't their feelings. That's what I would
okay,
say.
well, I don't. Yeah, I think okay, this is going to be an issue. I mean, we just have, I think, very different views on, I don't know, like how language works. Like, I don't think, I mean, you seem to be like, I don't know, it seems to be like you're saying that, like, okay, even when they say eating meat is right, even if when they say that, they just mean to express the proposition, um, I approve of eating meat,
But they're making a
you're
moral
saying
claim.
something false.
They're making a
Well,
moral
but
claim.
when
They're not
they,
just saying preferences,
no, they're
right?
asserting the proposition that they have a positive attitude towards eating meat, and it's a correct statement. The proposition they affirmed is correct.
Yeah, but remember they're making a moral claim. That's the important bit.
Well, sure, they're making okay. I mean, they're making a moral. Well, what do you mean by moral claim?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is going to be helpful, as sort of mentioned prior.
Okay, well, I mean, because I don't know. It seems like you. I don't know. I mean, based on what you're saying, it seems like you think that like when someone says something that the proposition that they're expressing when they make a statement can just be some kind of completely different proposition than like what they were intending to express when they made the statement. Like if they say eating meat is right, and all they intend to express is I approve of eating meat. I mean, if you're saying that what they're saying is false, it seems like you're saying that like the proposition they express, it's not what they intended to, and it's somehow like some completely different proposition about the non-natural moral facts, even though that had nothing to do with what they were intending to express when they made that statement.
But remember, they're making a moral claim. That's what matters here. If you want to say instead, like they just say wrong, but they're not actually making any moral claim at all. Like, oh yeah, sure, they're not saying something false.
Well, okay, I mean,
That's the issue.
I don't even know how we evaluate whether it is a
Because
moral
remember,
claim or
if I'm
not
a moral,
if we're
well,
not clear on what moral claim means
well,
here.
here's the thing, right? Like if I'm like a moral non-naturalist realist, right? So I think moral claims are about like non-natural moral facts, right? So if someone's making a moral claim and they're mistaken about what the content of morality is, which this person would be, then I'm saying, oh, that's a moral claim. That's false. But I'm not saying that they're mistaken when they say, oh, I've got this preference. Like that's the difference.
Yeah, I'm just not seeing how what they say is false because the proposition they're expressing just is I approve of eating meat, which is true. Like regardless of whether this person like characterizes it as a moral claim, like they can say, yes, I'm making a moral claim when I say eating meat is right. I mean, by like moral claim, if when they say moral claim, they just mean a statement about my attitude. It's like, well, that's a statement about their attitudes. They have a positive attitude towards eating meat. The claim is true. Like I don't.
Oh,
There's this
so
weird, yeah.
when you say they make a moral claim, they're not actually making a moral claim.
Okay, well, I don't know about like this, like actually.
Like,
This is like, this is all like weird stuff to me. Like they're like whether they're actually making a moral claim or not. Like whether they're making a moral claim or not, it's just dependent on like what one means by the term moral claim. So like, yeah, if they use moral claim to mean a statement about one's attitudes, then yes, they're making a moral claim. If by moral claim you mean a statement about non-natural stance-independent moral facts, then no, they're not making a moral claim. But I don't know what you're talking about when you like invoke stuff like, oh, is it actually a moral claim?
Oh, it's more like, they're using the same language, but they're not actually referring to the same thing. It's like the God analogy. Like the guy's not making a theistic claim when he says God comes into the courthouse, unless he's actually saying, oh, the literal God is walking into the courthouse.
Yeah, but I mean, if he says he is making a theistic claim, and by theistic claim he just means um, a
Not a
statement
theistic
about
claim.
God. Well, no, like you're just like, I mean, it seems like you're just equivocating on the term. Like you're talking about some completely other sense of the term than they're talking about.
Anyway.
Like the meaning of like a statement, it's fixed by what determines it. It's like what the speaker is trying to say. It's not like how you would use the language. So if I like, I don't know, say like, this is like, if they say like, this is morally right, and by morally right, they just mean a, they approve of it. What morally right there means when they say it, it's fixed by what they are meaning. It's not like fixed by what you or what some other person would mean by the term morally right.
Well, once again, it sort of seems like then the error theorist would be committed to saying that some moral claims are true, or some moral claims in some sense are true.
Okay, yeah, depending on what you mean by moral claim, then yes. I mean, there's always like an analysis, like, I mean, like with whatever, like it depends what you intend, what you're talking about when you say moral claim. Like, I don't know, like I don't really see, like it's the same thing with the atheist thing. It's like if you say like, oh, like, does God exist? Does an atheist think God exists? Well, I mean, that depends on what you mean by God. If you mean like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all good creator of the universe, then no, the atheist does not think that God exists. But if by God you mean, just this human who has the legal name God, then yeah, you could be an atheist and think that God exists. Like it all just depends on
But
like what you mean by the terms in question.
remember, like the theistic claims make the difference here. It's like maybe it could be like, let's suppose.
But whether something is a theistic claim depends. That's the same thing. It depends on what you mean by theistic claim. So, like, what do you mean by theistic claim?
Come about like the actual God.
Okay,
right?
well, what does God mean there?
Well, if you're an atheist, you're going to think, you're basically going to take like the equivalent of like an error theory. It's like, oh, God is the being with the omni properties. That's all he could be, right?
No,
And he doesn't exist, therefore atheism is true. God does not exist. Therefore, all like claims about God commanding stuff, God doing stuff are all systematically false. But suppose someone comes up to them in the streets like, oh, I'm a theist, like, but God's just energy. Then they're like, no, that's false. God refers to the omni property, right?
Okay, well,
but I'm not saying that energy doesn't exist.
Okay, well, so no, okay. I mean, I'm an atheist. I would call myself an atheist. If someone said to me, "God exists," and then I ask them, "Oh, what do you mean by God?" and they say, "Oh, I mean energy," and that's really what they mean by God, I would say they are saying something true when they say that God exists.
But
because all they mean by God is energy.
But I think
It's a
we'd
true
still say, like,
proposition.
if we're analogous to the error theorists, right? We'd be like, but God could only be this thing, this omni property being with the
Yeah,
omni
I'm not
properties,
even.
rather.
I
But
don't know that I even understand what that means to say it could only be this. Like you can only use the term to refer to this thing, why would that be the case?
That's just what like atheism would be, or at least like if it's analogous to error theory.
I just like so in order to
Don't
be an error
like,
theorist, you have to have like this weird kind of like view that when people make statements, like the propositions they express is like how it can have nothing to do with what the speaker is attempting to communicate. Like then if that's the case, if that's how we're interpreting it, then I think like error theory and subjectivism, I mean, they're all just problematic because they have these like weird problematic views about like meaning.
okay.
Okay, well, I don't think we're going to resolve this because we're probably just going to like we're probably just going to be like saying the same things if we continue
Yep.
on this specific point.
Let's move on to, I suppose, like, because also one big accusation is that ordinary folks, or reasonable ordinary folks who don't know much about meta ethics, will be misled to believe false things about these views. That was the like normative entanglement, right?
Yeah.
That was the main criticism. As opposed to, oh, are these arguments, or I suppose it was a bit about, are these arguments true, because that might come into the conversation about whether they're misleading or not. But I guess maybe just outline what you took normative entanglement to sort of be talking about. Then I suppose we can just talk about whether someone reasonable would sort of come to these mistaken conclusions. And then we can talk about whether I think they are mistaken.
Okay, so for example, in the subjectivism argument that you provide, where it's something like, I believe, P1, if subjectivism is true, then someone who doesn't care to save a drowning child has no moral obligation to save a drowning child. Someone, yep. P2, someone that doesn't care to save a drowning child does have a moral obligation to save a drowning child.
Yep.
Conclusion, therefore, subjectivism is false.
Yep. I suppose this would sort of just apply to any view that says like moral requirement, sort of tied to one's cares in this way. But putting that aside.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that is there is a normative entanglement issue there. I know you say in your response article, you say, oh, I didn't intend to, imply that this about subjectivists, that subjectivists can't think it's wrong to refrain from saving a drowning child, and you make clear in your latest article about it that no, subjectivists can say that it's still wrong.
Yep.
I mean, you didn't really seem to make in the original article that I responded to initially. You weren't really clear about that, and I think absolutely someone would see that and they would get the impression that if you're a subjectivist, you think that if someone doesn't care to save a drowning child, then it's not wrong for them to save a drowning child. And I think, like a good number of people would get that impression, and like an even higher number of people would, at the very least, get the impression that you think that's the case, that subjectivists are committed to believing it's not wrong.
Yeah, good. So first thing first, if my only argument was that I didn't intend to mislead, that wouldn't address normative entanglement. Like normative entanglement can be both intentional and unintentional. So I want to agree with that point, right? If that's all that I meant, then that wouldn't address the problem. Luckily, I did also mean that I didn't think I was tricking people into believing, or at least someone reasonable into believing something false. I think the main reason why is that the argument really focuses in on this requirement to rescue and this caring to rescue. Now, earlier on, like I think like first, second paragraph of my original article, I sort of give like a really rough definition of what subjectivism is. Like, oh, morality is like determined by like what the individual cares about, that sort of thing. But I'm not sure if someone would read this first premise, someone reasonable would read this first premise and just be convinced by it on the first hand. And at the same time, I'm not sure they immediately start thinking about whether subjectivists themselves can't say what they did was wrong. Because there seems to be a difference between like being required to do something, especially if we're talking about this tie between caring and not being required. Because that also obviously implies that, oh, if you do care, then you do have this requirement. You would think it's wrong, yada, yada. And so I think those just sort of, I'm just not exactly convinced that someone reasonable would just read this argument and sort of come away with like, oh, subjectivists, they just can't, you know, they can't say they dislike what happened here, or they don't care about what happened here. It seems a bit of a reach, especially since I don't exactly defend these arguments either. Like maybe a bit for my error theory argument because I like have a small detail at the very top, but just for some context for the audience, sort of outline like a very brief idea of where I'm coming from. I give a very rough definition of subjectivism and error theory. Then I give two syllogisms without any support. Then I just sort of move on to the main point of the article, which is about whether they're question begging. So I don't know, it feels like a reach to sort of say like a reasonable person will come across my article, read the syllogism, they'd be like, that must be true. It's like, maybe, and I guess this might come into whether it's relevant or not to whether they think I believe it, because that would only be relevant as this charge goes insofar as someone would just trust what I say. Because then if they, oh, he believes that, and I'm just going to believe whatever he believes. But even then, like such a person would still sort of read this argument, and it's a bit of a reach to say like they'll also conclude that someone can't say, or if they're a subjectivist, that they can't say this moral monster hasn't done something wrong. Because obviously they can say like, oh, yeah, the subjectivists can say they care about this person not doing it, which I'm assuming is what your worry was, Travis.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I mean, I think if you say that someone thinks that there's no moral obligation to do X, I think a lot of people are going to come away with the interpretation that you're saying, oh, they think it's permissible to do X, especially if you don't clarify like, oh, I'm not saying that. Like, if I were to just say, if someone were to just like see me saying to you, like, you don't think that there's a moral obligation to not set cats on fire, I think people would interpret me saying that as I'm making the accusation that that you are fine with setting cats on fire, that you think it's permissible to set cats on fire.
Yeah,
I mean, do you agree with that?
I'm inclined to agree, but that's not what the first premise looks like. It's not merely that if subjectivism is true, then no one has a requirement to save drowning children, right? It's that if they don't care, they don't have a requirement,
okay,
which gets people thinking about that tie.
To you, I said, you think that like people don't have an obligation to set like cats on fire, or well, I don't know if I said that incorrect. You don't think people have a moral obligation to refrain from setting cats on fire if they don't care if they want to set cats on fire, and if they have no desire to not set cats on fire. I mean, you agree that like probably most people would look at me saying that, and they would assume the way they would interpret me is that I'm accusing you of thinking it's morally permissible to set cats on fire,
I
as
don't.
long as like the person has no like desire to refrain from setting cats on fire.
No, because I think they're immediately going to start thinking that they're mistaken about this tie between caring and having a moral requirement. They'd be like, "Oh, but that's false because obviously we would have this moral requirement, even if they didn't care." But that's like the whole point of the argument, right?
Yeah, but
I'm still not sure that someone's gonna like if like supposing someone like takes that as like, oh my god, that's crazy, but is that premise true? Am I convinced that subjectivism implies that they can't say, oh, like, or that subjectivists don't care if people like obviously they wouldn't come away with that conclusion because all I'm supposing is, hey, this guy doesn't care. But obviously that doesn't imply that someone else can't care or that other subjectivists can't care.
okay, but like if like the person when
Which is,
for the set of people that don't care, they would, I think they would interpret me as saying like, you don't think though that group of people they don't have any obligation to refrain, or I'm sorry, that you don't think that it's wrong for them to set the cats on fire.
sorry,
I
could
think
you
that,
repeat that one?
yeah, sorry, I kind of like fucked that sentence up, but um, if I were to say to you, like, okay, your view is that if someone doesn't um, desire to refrain from setting a cat on fire, then they have no moral obligation to refrain from setting a cat on fire. I think most people, if they saw that interaction, they would interpret me as saying that you think that people who don't have a desire to refrain from setting cats on fire, that for those people it's permissible for them to set cats on fire. Do you disagree that that's how most people would interpret it?
Yeah, I would, because they're immediately going to start thinking about, oh, but clearly he's wrong about this tie between caring and having a requirement. Like that's what they'll be outraged by, which is the actual truth that I'm trying to get at, right? Because I think under your interpretation of like the different sort of things that what someone thinks a subjectivist is committed to, it sort of seems that what you're arguing is that if someone, like if you accuse me of that sort of thing you were saying before, people around would like automatically believe just on the face of that one assertion alone that, oh, he mustn't care if people like torture cats or something like that. But it's like, well, you said that someone who doesn't care doesn't have a requirement, but that doesn't imply anything about what I care about, right? That's my, it's both of those things working together that makes it a bit of a reach for me.
Okay, I mean, but you have to also take into account the fact, um, I mean, if you look at what people say about like subjectivism, and other like anti-realist views, um, a lot of people do have the impression that if you hold one of these views, you're committed to tolerating the just whatever actions someone does. Like, there's a lot of people who will say things like, "Oh, if you're like a moral relativist, uh, and someone tries to steal your wallet or like assault you, you cannot fight back. You would be violating your commitments by fighting back or not allowing them to take your wallet." And this is why you see people all the time say, like, no one lives as a moral relativist, or no one lives as a moral anti-realist. And it's not just, random people on Twitter or whatever either. Like, there are like professional philosophers who say this as well. Like Michael Humer says this, that, anti-realists, yeah, they might say, that there are no stance independent moral facts, but, all of them live as if moral realism is true. You also see like realists will explicitly say things like, if you're a subjectivist, you have to think that, if someone approves of like enslaving someone, then it's like permissible for them to, or more even morally right for them to enslave people. So you do have like this background of like lots of people like pretty clearly engaged in this normative entanglement, making all of these claims that if you're a subjectivist or anti-realist, you know, you have to be committed to these normative implications. And like lots of people like buy into that. So I think especially when that's the case, there's like a duty to, if you're presenting these views, to like be really clear about like what the subjectivist is and isn't committed to, especially when it's so like apt for misinterpretation from people.
But these folks wouldn't be familiar with those guys, would they? Because we're saying like, oh, someone who doesn't know like anything about meta ethics, right? So obviously
Okay, well, I
talking
mean,
about
I
like,
think
oh,
there's
these
like,
other realists are saying this and that. It's like, well, a bit of a side problem. But it is I think another example about what you were talking about is like the common idea that like, or like people who are trying to argue for like tolerance or something, and they're trying to argue in favor of like moral relativism because it sort of supposedly mandates tolerance of other cultures or something like that, which it doesn't, because it's like if one culture says intolerance bad, then it is. But that's interesting.
well, okay, so there's
But
like two things
yeah,
there. Like
still,
when you
still,
say, okay, someone who has nothing, who knows nothing about metaethics, who like sees your article, they wouldn't like know about these claims. I mean, okay, that I'll agree with like that. Okay, if they've never
cool.
like come across this issue before, yeah. So that's not really going to be relevant for them. But I mean, there's a lot of people who I think, you know, um, they do have some familiarity with metaethics. They've heard these other people say these things about like subjectivism. And I feel like for those people, when they read your article, they're just, to them it sounds like these things are being like just reinforced. And I think like there's some like duty to say like, no, actually, like this is a common, misinterpretation of subjectivism. Like I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here, like the scope of this argument I'm making against subjectivism, what subjectivists are and aren't committed to. And I just didn't see that in the article.
No, that's right. I'm a bit more inclined to agree now, because people do typically have those ideas about like relativism and stuff like that, just from just thinking about it on their own without like actually considering the actual implications of different views. But
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'm a little sympathetic though, because I still think it's enough of a reach. Like, I think you might have a point if he's just saying like, hey, dude, it's like there might be a handful of people that might get the wrong idea. Just put like a sentence in there just to clarify. Like, that's reasonable. That's fair enough. And I think I'll even do it after this recording is over. But I think to sort of say like, oh, this argument relies on this implicit assumption that everyone's going to, or maybe not everyone, but a lot of reasonable people are going to come to, and like that's normative entanglement and stuff like that. I'm like, whoa, 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 slow down. It's like I really tried to just really focus in on this tie between this, having an obligation and caring about something, which is what I think people will immediately think about as soon as they see this argument, right? This argument I haven't really defended, but if someone is like, smart enough, they sort of look around the other because I sort of have bits and pieces of support throughout the whole article. Like I've got a couple sentences in the introduction, but then I've sort of also got this bit where I talk about an objection, or I sort of say something like, actually, I'll just quote it. Some things really are right and wrong. Not caring about rescuing someone doesn't get you off the hook over a requirement to save them, and so forth. which is sort of what both of those arguments are really trying to get at. It's like, oh, we have to explain this stuff, these elements of morality that seem to be there. So if someone's clever enough to sort of see that, so like, I guess that's what they mean, as opposed to this other thing about, oh, subjectivists can't say that they've done something wrong or something like that. Or subjectivists automatically don't care if someone doesn't care to rescue a young child and doesn't have a requirement or something like that.
So
yeah. So somewhat right, but also still a bit of a stretch, because I think my arguments get by on their own, like on their actual merits, as opposed to like they only get by because like of this normative entanglement stuff.
So, okay, so I will say one aspect of the normative entanglement. When I made my original article responding to you, so like one thing is, first of all, when you said that like a subjectivist thinks there's no moral obligation to save a drowning child if like you don't want to, if they don't care about it. So I mean, I originally did interpret that as you saying that a subjectivist is committed to saying that if someone doesn't care about saving a drowning child, then it's morally permissible for them to refrain from saving them. And I don't think that is at all an unreasonable interpretation, especially when that is like explicitly what so many realists and critics of subjectivism like explicitly argue. They explicitly say, yeah, if like someone has like this positive attitude towards this, then you have to say it's right. I mean, this stuff about
that's exactly what I said. I'm talking about like requirements, but
well, I know
does raise
I'm
an
not
interesting
saying
point.
that you said that. I'm saying that like
given
that like so many realists do like say this, I'm so used to this being an argument that people present against subjectivism. I don't think me interpreting it as okay, this is just like another variation of this is an unreasonable interpretation.
Well, it sort of gets at two things. It's like, well, some realists make certain arguments, but I make my own arguments. Like, so I think they should just be, interpreted as they are. But I think like if someone is used to seeing a pattern of certain arguments, then if they see a sort of similar argument, but it's relevantly different, they might be inclined to interpret a certain way, which, would only be true for folks who are familiar with these sorts of arguments, such as yourself. So in that sense, it's like, I don't blame you for coming to that interpretation because of your history thinking about these other arguments. You misinterpreted this one. That's fine. But it also gets to the other point about how we're understanding moral requirements too. Because I think if we interpret moral requirement in the way you want to, my argument, like at least the first premise, would be saying that subjectivists don't think or subjectivists think like it's perfectly fine for this guy to just not do it because he doesn't care or something. When I'd actually have a different interpretation or a different understanding of what an actual moral requirement is. It's like, oh, my desires can't like give someone else a moral requirement, but under like subjectivist talk, it might be like, all I mean when I say someone has a requirement to rescue a drowning child is just like, I want them to do it, or I prefer that they do it, which is not right. At least I would say it's mistaken. Well, but we can talk about that.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, well, I use moral language in a subjectivist way. I mean, I'm not a subjectivist.
Sure.
Because I see subjectivism as making the semantic thesis about ordinary moral discourse, and I don't get on board with that. I don't know what most people are doing when they make moral judgments. But like when I make moral judgments, yeah, Lance has the same position. Well, I think Lance actually kind of endorses like a further kind of view. Like he endorses like indeterminacy. Like he thinks when most people make moral judgments, like it doesn't refer to any specific metaphysical theory at all. I don't really make that claim. I'm kind of just like agnostic about the semantic thesis. But I mean, anyway, so like I would say, for example, people have a moral obligation to go vegan. I don't care if they don't
True, by the
want to
way.
go vegan. Well, I mean, of course it's true. I mean, you agree that I approve of people going vegan, right? But yeah, so I would say like, yeah, they have a moral obligation to do it, regardless of if they want to do it or not. Um, I mean, when I say that, all I mean is that I'm just making a statement about like my attitudes, like something like, oh, I approve of them going vegan, or like I prefer that they go vegan, something like that.
Uh-huh. So I suppose like, is it sort of a bit more of an expressivist sort of talk where you're sort of saying something but you don't literally mean that? It's like you have a moral like requirement to do X, but all I'm really saying is that, oh, I just want you to do X. You don't literally have a moral requirement to do it. Would that be sort of the
No,
correct
okay, well,
interpretation of what's going on?
no, I mean, I wouldn't get on board with that framing of
Okay,
it,
cool. Good,
because
good.
like I don't accept that like when I say um, they have a moral obligation to do it, like I don't I don't think that I'm using that term non-literally, or I'm saying they don't actually have a moral obligation to do it. Like I think no, they do have an actual moral obligation to do it. It's just that moral obligation, all that means is it's just to say that I like want them to do it.
I guess we might be understanding moral requirements in different senses because what I would sort of think of it as, it'd be like, oh, a moral requirement is like basically something in the realm of like a moral reason that is strong enough to be practically relevant. So you just can't like, shrug it off or something like that. It's like, oh, you've got a moral requirement to be a vegan. It's like, that means it's like a good reason for you to be a vegan. It's like, oh, animal lives matter, or like your purchase makes a difference, or however you want to cash out, like a consumer ethic or something like that. That's sort of what I would talk about with moral requirements. But I don't see how my own preferences could ground like moral requirements or even just reasons alone from my own preferences. It's like, oh, I want someone to do this, but that doesn't seem to give them a reason to do anything, unless perhaps they care about what I care about, or there's some objective moral fact of the matter that says they have to take what I want seriously. But it's like, if it's sort of, it would seem very unnatural if I was to sort of like, I do street activism sometimes, and I sort of like, I'm trying to argue that these folks have a moral requirement to become like vegans, right? It'd be sort of weird. I'm like, oh, hey, you have a moral requirement to become a vegan. Like, oh yeah, well, what's the argument? I'm like, well, I want you to be vegan. You convinced? I'm assuming they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, they'd either say something like, oh, if that's all you meant by moral requirement, it's like, that's not really a moral requirement. That's just like, whatever. That doesn't give me any reason to do anything. But that would seem to trivialize what a moral requirement is. It's like, you can have a moral requirement to do something, but without any sort of reason to do it. You can just sort of shrug it off. But that doesn't seem to be what a moral requirement is. It's like, if you've got a moral requirement to do something, like all else being equal, you got to do it. It's not just, you can't just be like, whatever. They'll,
Yeah, well, I mean,
requirements,
okay, well, it depends on
requirements,
what you mean by
requirements, like whatever.
you've got to do it. Like, I mean, I don't think you can just like shrug your shoulders and be like, I don't really care. It's like, no, you've got to do it. But like that itself is just, within the framework of like my stances. I don't.
Well, I think it'd be more referring to like, strong enough reasons, like considerations, like for example, like facts that favor or oppose certain actions from agents. Like I don't think my own desires on their own can give reasons for anyone. Like maybe for me, though, you'd have like, it's a bit tricky just given how reasons sort of are grounded, because it like takes a fact, then you have to have some sort of desire, yada yada. But putting that bit aside, I think our desires can ground reasons for us, but not for other people on their own. You can sort of imagine like a reverse case where it's like, oh, someone wants me to eat meat or something. Like they've got a desire for me to do it. I'm like, that doesn't give me any reason to do it. At least not by itself. It sort of seems like if that's all a reason is, like, it's not really normative at all. So yeah, that's sort of my gripe.
Okay, a few things about it. So, one thing to say is that about the way, because I saw you talk about this in the comments, where you like kind of said a similar sort of thing, where you said like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't think like my desires or anyone's desires, they're just going to somehow generate, moral demands of us.
On their own, yeah.
And it's like, well, I mean, the thing about that is, so I mean, I wouldn't phrase it as, like someone's desires generate, moral demands. It's not as if like somehow like someone has this desire to for you to go vegan, and then all of a sudden because of that, like some like moral demand just like poofs like into existence. Like, well, no, to say that you have a moral like demand, or there's a moral obligation to um to uh to go vegan or whatever it is, like it's just the same thing as saying that you have a desire. So it would be like, if we translate it, it would be like saying like, oh, these desires like generate desires. It's like, well, no, it's like just the same thing. It'd be like saying that like me enjoying the taste of a food, like it generates like tastiness. Well, I wouldn't say it like that. I would just say me enjoying the food, like that's just what tastiness refers to. It's the same thing. It's not like generating something new.
Yeah, I suppose that's going to probably trivialize them, because as I was sort of saying before, like moral requirements seem to have this tie, I'd even say like necessary tie, to various moral reasons that are strong enough to be practically relevant, right? But I think like if we're going to say like, oh, this moral monster who doesn't rescue kids because he doesn't care has a requirement, we're going to have to say, oh, he's got a reason to do it. But if all we're saying is like, oh, I just want him to do it, like that doesn't seem to give him a reason at all.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm fine with saying he has moral reason to do it as well. It's just that, well, you're not going to like my account of what a moral
Yeah, so
reason,
not talking about reasons
is.
anymore. Yeah, I see.
Well, I mean, not talking about reasons anymore. Like, sure, we're not talking about what you mean by the term reason. I mean, that's how I use the term reason. But then it's like, well, I don't care if something doesn't like count as like what you describe as a reason. Like, that doesn't bother me at all. I don't see why I need those reasons.
Well, in any sense, it would mean that I don't think my argument's mistaken. That's the important point here. Because if by requirement I'm talking about like different things like reasons, then I would just say like your view's mistaken, so I'm not misleading anyone. I think that's also a crux here.
Okay, well, I mean, I think.
Like, you might claim I'm being misleading, but it's like, oh, that's not true. Requirement's this thing, not this other thing. Yada yada.
Okay, well, I mean, the misleading thing. I mean, I'm not saying that you had any intent to mislead. I think that it does.
Yeah, all unintentional. All unintentional.
I mean, if we're going to like phrase the argument in like the way, well, I mean, we're going to have a problem here with like, what do you mean by reason then?
I can redefine
I'm still
it if you
not
want.
sure if you. Sorry, say that again.
I can redefine it if you want.
Okay, redefine it.
I mean, if you're a fan of Lance, you're probably not going to like this at all, but here it goes. Reasons are considerations that favor or oppose certain actions from agents, roughly. And those considerations can be like facts of various sorts, or all the way to things like states of affairs, stuff like that. A common example might be like, oh, a bottle contains poison is a reason, to keep it away from children because like of some moral requirement to, protect kids from danger, not to be negligent, and also because like, you don't want to go to prison, or you don't, you care about the welfare of children and stuff like that. So those sort of desires and those moral requirements are going to be the grounds of this reason, of this fact. That's going to favor you
So a
doing certain
reason
things.
is something that counts in favor of an action.
Roughly.
Right.
Because you want to say like, oh, it counts in favor of an action from an agent in situation X or something like, But putting those like extra bits aside, it's like,
Yeah, well, okay. So, I don't have any problem with just describing it as a reason is something that counts in favor of an action. The issue is I don't think we mean the same thing by counts in favor of an action.
Well, what would you sort of cash it out as? I'm not sure how I'd cash it out, to be honest, because it seems more fundamental.
Well, I take it that when I talk about like reasons and like something counting in favor, it's like I would kind of describe it in this way. Like, let's say I'm like thirsty, going and getting like a bottle of water or whatever, that would quench my thirst. That would like achieve my goal of like not being thirsty anymore. And so like in that sense, you could say like me getting the water counts in favor, or like getting the water like counts in favor. But it's like I don't think there's anything like additional besides that sort of just like consistency relation that doing this would achieve some particular goal.
Yeah, so it's going to really depend upon like how we cash out reasons as well, because obviously they're going to be two different sorts. If you accept my sort of view, like there's going to be categorical reasons and there's hypothetical reasons. But I think both are going to be irreducible, right? They're not going to be reducible to like something else, like pure desires, for instance, especially for hypothetical reasons. It's rather the desires are going to be the grounds of those reasons, as opposed to the reasons themselves, which is a bit of a subtle distinction.
I don't grant any like account of reasons that involve like it being irreducible. To be honest, I'm not even really sure what you're talking about when you talk about these sorts of like irreducibly normative reasons. I don't have a concept like that.
I would expect nothing more from a fan of Lance. So
okay,
don't feel bad. That's what it's all about. Just from my experience. But I suppose at the end of the day, it does mean like I don't think what I'm saying is mistaken in this argument.
Okay, well,
talking about reasons and so,
if the argument invokes like these irreducibly like normative reasons, so I wouldn't say the argument works. I don't know how to evaluate the truth premises. The truth values of the premises, because I don't know what the propositions refer to. In fact, I don't even know if they are propositional at all, if they, invoke this term. But that sounds like gibberish. But I don't really know.
How very Lance of you.
Yeah. I don't know. Was there anything else? Oh, there actually is one more thing.
A couple of things like legitimate criticism.
Yeah.
That's, and maybe whether including all right is enough in the error theory argument. Well, people will come to believe that error theorists are evil, that sort of thing. I think that might be it for most of it, I'd say. So which one do you want to start with? Legitimate criticism or?
Yeah, let's do the legitimate criticism thing.
Cool.
So I know you say that subjectivists, they don't have the grounds to legitimately criticize people with other moral views. So I guess you would say, okay, well, how would you phrase it? How would you phrase it?
Yeah, it's going to be like specifically like, they've got coherent sets of beliefs and like they actually know what they stand for. So they're not just like completely mistaken about what they claim to prefer and stuff like that. So like this individual, cannot be cannot be
Okay, so
legitimately
it's
criticized.
not we're excluding sort of things like they're mistaken about their own preferences.
Yeah. It's like you
Okay.
claim you don't care about animals, but really you do. You know, that sort of accounting for that sort of thing. Because they can be like, yeah, that's your mistake. You're just wrong about what you care about.
Yeah.
So you have these reasons to, you know, to be a vegan and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So putting those folks
I
aside.
guess unfortunately I cannot criticize carnists legitimately. But anyway, so
Oof.
like the thing about legitimate criticism, like you describe in your article, like you take, in order for something to be a critique, you have to be criticizing someone for, there has to be you have to be pointing to some mistake that they're making.
Yeah,
Um,
broadly
Now the
speaking,
thing
yeah.
about this is, so I mean, I'm assuming by mistake, and I say this in my article, you mean something broader than like a factual error, because presumably you could have someone with like 100% correct beliefs who's like aware of all the stance independent moral facts,
Yeah,
but just
yeah,
doesn't comply with them. And I assume you
yeah,
would say they're still making a mistake.
yeah.
So you're
They're not
kind
going
of
along. Yeah.
including like not acting in accordance with the stance independent moral facts. That's like under the umbrella of a mistake.
Oh, in terms of like, they're not being adequately, like they're not acting in line with the reasons that apply to them, essentially. Because like these moral facts are supposed to give them reasons to do things, and that's why they're making this mistake when they don't act in line with them. It's like a normative mistake, I suppose, if you want to put it like that, maybe. And then I
Yeah,
suppose you
so
go on to sort of say like, oh, if we sort of take this seriously, it's like how we're going to hold on to this idea that we can criticize food and movies, artwork, stuff like that without sort of coming into contact with like gastronomic realism or aesthetic realism and something like that. And I suppose the argument might be like, oh, but we can criticize in these areas, so there's something wrong here. That's sort of a right
yeah, that's what I would
interpretation.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose because the first article I don't even like, I sort of mention it in one sentence and like that's it. And I don't even mention the part about like, oh, they're also correct when they say these things. But just sort of maybe widen the scope a little bit. I think like with legitimate criticism, it's always going to, it's going to come back down to reasons again. It's sort of like maybe to give a real live example, it's like in your article, you claim that I have like an active duty to not mislead my audience. Of course, I deny I'm misleading them, but suppose I was. I think this criticism would amount to like it'd be legitimate, right? Like I'd have reasons to be more careful next time. I'd have reasons to go back and update my articles, so forth. I couldn't just shrug off the requirement of whatever sort, maybe like could be epistemic or moral, that sort of thing. It doesn't seem like I'd be at liberty to just ignore you. Be like, oh, your arguments like rely on normative entanglement. And supposing that was true, it's like, big deal. I don't care. It's like, that doesn't seem like an adequate response. Like I have to take what you say seriously. But I think when it comes to what we might call criticism, when it comes to things like food or movies, I'm not sure if they would be legitimate criticisms. It's probably more like complaints of various sorts. Maybe you even want to call them like legitimate complaints. Because I think when we want to criticize like an artist for maybe like they draw hands weirdly, it's like that doesn't seem to give them any reason to change what they're doing, at least not in itself. Like you might want to draw on other implications like, oh, you're the best customer and they care about making you happy. So that then they might have some sort of relevant desire that might do the work here. But assuming they don't care, it's like, you don't like my hands, big deal. It's like, whatever. And I think the same sort of goes to food too. It's like, oh, I'm criticizing this food because it's too salty or something like that. And then, suppose the chef just doesn't care. It's just like, whatever. Like supposing there's no other considerations there, like, they made a promise to make you food that you would like, or they made some, like you paid them money to give them this sort of thing. Or maybe the chef cares about keeping like a lively customer base, that sort of thing. But it doesn't seem like our complaints or our criticisms alone in those areas are going to be able to actually ground these requirements to change, which is what seems to be the case in these other areas. Like when I say like, oh, I'm making a legitimate criticism about this guy's moral view because he's like a meat eater. And I think that's like, oh, that actually, yeah, that really shows that he is going off the wrong foot here. He's got reasons to change. He has reasons to, forego the animal products and stuff like that. As opposed to like, big deal. You just don't like what I'm doing. Yeah, I can just sort of shrug it off. I've got no reasons to comply. Those sorts
Well,
of
I
things.
mean, the thing about them not caring, I mean, that could just happen either way. I mean, if someone's about to like gun you down and you tell them there's a stance independent moral fact that commands them not to do so, they're just not going to care about that and shoot you anyway.
Oh yeah,
so
but
like,
they're still wrong. That's the
well, sure,
that's the
they're
thing.
still wrong, but I mean, yeah, I mean, the meat eater who says like, "Oh, I don't care about what you think. I'm going to keep eating meat anyway." Like, yeah, well, they're still wrong. They're still doing something immoral. So, I mean, now if you want to say,
They've
like,
also got
yeah, but
reasons to
like
act
we
differently.
want something. Well, I mean, I would say they have reason. I mean, it's just going to be like I guess the issue here is like you want like this particular like account, like okay, it has to be this stance independent, irreducibly normative reason
Not
that they
stance
have.
independent necessarily. Like I think hypothetical norms are also going to be irreducible, and those just depend on like whether some fact exists and whether you have some sort of desire. Because I'm sort of specified in these cases, like yeah, the artist and the cook doesn't really care about about your complaints. It's like yeah, they've got no reason. But if they did care, then it could amount to some sort of legitimate criticism because you're pointing to some like error, something like you're showing them they've got a reason to do what you say. But in the case where they don't care, it's just like, whatever. They've got no hypothetical reason to listen to you. Yes, you're right. This, gunman might not be convinced, but that's a bit of a different story to whether he's actually got these requirements. And I think if I was to say something like, oh, I can legitimately criticize this guy. He's like not respecting me by just shooting me in the head. And I think that amounts to more of a legitimate criticism rather than something just like a complaint or something like that, or some sort of legitimate complaint. With, the difference being like
Okay,
having
well,
reasons and
I
stuff.
mean, I don't see the problem with a subjectivist not being able to legitimately criticize other people in the sense that you mean when you say legitimately criticize.
Yeah,
Like,
we have to disagree.
I'm
Yeah.
fine with, you know, I'm fine with saying like, okay, I have this other sense of legitimately criticize, and I think on this sense I can legitimately criticize others. I don't need like this kind of extra stuff. I'm not like that doesn't bother me. That I can't say that I can't say oh like the Carnus, there's some additional like thing like above and beyond my like dislike of suffering that makes what they're doing wrong or makes them have a reason to stop this. I mean, I don't see what the issue is supposed to be.
Well, in any case, I sort of get around your concern, I'd say, which is like, oh, can't hold on to this criticism in these other domains. We're going to have to like buy into gastronomic realism and stuff like that, which is absurd. But I'm like, we don't, they're not legitimate criticism in those areas. In those certain cases, they're more like complaints, which is, I think, is fine. And it seems like you just want
Okay.
to say like all these things are just like complaints. Which I suppose, like, if you want to say like there's something wrong with my view, then clearly there's going to be something wrong with your view. So I think we're happy campers here.
Okay. Well, I just if you want to say like, okay, this is what you mean by legitimately criticize,
Yeah, has a
and
tie
as
with reasons. Yeah.
subjectivists can't do this. It's like, okay, that's kind of it's a trivial statement, and I don't see why it would
Oh,
be
I
a
totally
problem.
disagree. I think it's the
You don't think
epitome
it's
of
like
non-trivial.
I
It's like
don't
this is
like
what
if you
really
say,
matters.
well, really there is, well, seems like another gibberish term, but
Uh-huh.
so I don't know. I guess there's the um So there's the thing about saying that error theorists
Yeah.
think that genocide is permissible.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's say it's false. Yeah.
yeah, well, I wouldn't say that it's false. I'm going to say, because my view of
Well,
the
error theorists
meaning
would,
of
sorry.
things,
Yeah, error
it's
theorists
going
would
to
say it's
depend
false.
on like what you mean by that. So if by not
Mm.
permissible, um, like if when you say that error theorists think genocide is permissible, if by permissible you just mean not impermissible, I mean like okay, I'm not going to say you're like affirming anything false there, but I mean I think it is kind of, I don't like that use of language. I object to that sort of use of language, like attaching the permissible like label to it. Like I don't really see why we would do that, aside to just have these like negative connotations that come with saying someone thinks genocide is permissible.
Oh, mainly because if I say that, error theorists say that the quote, like the saying genocide is permissible is false, a natural interpretation could be, oh, so they must think it's impermissible. Though that being said, I do think the inclusion of the all right in the first premise. So just to reiterate for the audience, the first premise was if moral error theory is true, then there is nothing wrong or right with genocide. It's like, I think if you take the two different ways someone might see that, they sort of come together into like where someone might just be like, oh, I'm not really seeing this as like a first order claim that error theorists are making. It's like if someone just says something like, oh, nothing wrong with genocide, you're like, what? You're a terrible person. You're evil, right? Which is, why I didn't phrase it like that. But if someone just says something like, oh, genocide, there's nothing right with genocide, that immediately sounds like, oh, they're not fine with genocide. They're really against genocide. But I think if you combine them together, like someone's not going to go either way because that'd just be like a contradiction. They're like, oh, so error theorists are perfectly fine and not perfectly fine with genocide. Like, surely a reasonable person's not going to think that, right? They sort of have to, they're forced to not think of them as first order moral claims. And I also specify in the bit above, in the first sort of, I think even second or first sentence, I say like, oh, moral error theory implies that like there's nothing wrong or right with genocide because nothing is wrong or right. So someone's like, oh, okay, so it's not error theory, it's just sort of like being fine with genocide. It's just they don't think anything is right or wrong. So of course, trivially, genocide is not going to be wrong or right either. You could put anything in that premise and it would come out. But of course, I focus on genocide because it's like a clear instance where someone's like, oh, but there does seem something wrong with that. Morality does seem to say that those things are bad. So that's why we should think error theory is mistaken, which is like the whole point of the article. So the whole point of that argument, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like, I mean, you did include the term, like, you did include like or right, and I did
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
in
You did
my
say that.
article,
Yeah.
like, did say like, okay, I'm glad that they made that specification because a lot of critics of error theory kind of leave that out,
Yep.
which I think has this kind of rhetorical effect.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess there's this separate issue of like you could think, um, saying something that's like saying, okay, they don't think genocide, they don't think it's wrong, but they don't think it's right either. I mean, that's better than just saying, okay, they don't think it's wrong and that's it. But like,
For sure.
you could, I think that still, I mean, because you could have, someone who doesn't think something, I mean, just like as an example, like counting blades of grass, like you might think, okay, it's not wrong to count blades of grass. It's not morally right to do it, but I mean, it is permissible. It's fine to do. It's morally neutral. Um, so I don't know, and I feel like if you say that something is permissible, um, you know, that gives off this different kind of impression. Um, it has this sort of like connotation of when you say something is permissible to that like, oh, they're okay with it. Like I don't know, why not just say, um, like error theorists, they don't think it's permissible or impermissible. Like I don't. That seems like a better way to phrase it to me.
Well, I don't. I think it would just be superfluous. That's my issue. Because I think just people get that idea when they see that there's nothing wrong or right. So what's going on here? Clearly, it's not like a first order moral claim. The error theorists isn't contradicting themselves. Like they're not saying like I'm in favor of and not in favor of genocide. It's like, well, clearly not. So it's something else is going on here. But I think at the same time, like people who have no idea about metaethics and they're reasonable. Like I got some of my non-philosophy friends to sort of have a look at it, and they're like, I have no idea what error theory is, and they sort of like they read the argument, they're like, I don't really know what's going on, even though like there's like a rough definition and stuff like that, because the whole point of that article wasn't even supposed to argue for those views. But I think it's just a bit of a stretch to say. Well, I think it's a stretch just to say that someone would be convinced by the argument or come to believe them just because like as presented, unless they're clever and they look at like some of the other clues I put around, like the first sentence where I say like, error theory implies that nothing is right or wrong. Someone's gonna like, so if that's true, then obviously the first premise is true. So unless they do that, I don't really see how they'd even be convinced of it, let alone come away with this other idea that the error theorists think, genocide, perfectly fine. Because I think
I
if
do want
someone's,
to.
but yeah,
So I did want to clarify something I said earlier. I was looking at the chat a bit on the normative entanglement aspect. So when I was bringing up, you have all these realists who say this, and then you pointed out and you said, well, yeah, but someone with who has little familiarity with metaethics, they're not going to have heard all these other realists saying this. So like that kind of point doesn't apply. And I like agreed, okay, in that case it doesn't apply. I do want to just make clear about that.
Sure.
I agree that consideration doesn't apply there, but I don't think that means, it's still off the hook for normative entanglement, because I think that the layman, well, I mean, it seems very common, at least in my experience, that people have this like weird idea that if something is like not objectively wrong, it does imply some like notion of tolerance. I mean, a lot of people seem to have this idea. I mean, there's a reason you see it like all the time expressed, including even by professional philosophers, even though it's not correct. So, I mean, for whatever reason, people are very apt to have this sort of like thought that like, if you think there's no objective morality, you must just be okay with everything. So I do think like even if they don't have that sort of familiarity with metaethics, even if they never even heard the term metaethics before, they have no idea what, like they've never heard moral anti-realism or moral realism, never heard of any of these terms. I think it's still important to clarify, okay, this is a common misinterpretation of like subjectivism or like these other anti-realist views. It does not entail this, despite kind of this what seems to be like a relatively common misperception about it.
I think you even said it before, and I sort of partly agreed. Like, that's right. Yeah, it's like similar to how some folks argue for moral relativism because they think it's going to support like a universal moral rule for tolerance or something, which is like, on its face, is like that's literally a contradiction.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people who, I mean, I was actually talking with Lance about this, I think yesterday, but there are people, you do see people online, who will be like, they'll kind of like invoke, well, there's like a certain like series of phrases that they like to say, like, morality is relative, or morality is subjective. And the kind of like implication there is like we shouldn't impose our moral values on anyone else.
It's sort of a bit of a question whether those folks are reasonable as well. It's like,
Well,
like
I
a-
mean, I
it's like
guess
any
the
argument
thing
could be
is,
misleading in some sense. Like anyone, like it's possible someone could misread it, but it's like, are they reasonable? Are they actually paying attention? Or they're just sort of browsing over and be like, oh, whatever.
well, I mean, the thing
Yeah.
is, like, we can say it's unreasonable, like, for someone to just have this idea that, subjectivism, like, entails this, or like some notion of tolerance. I mean, even if that is like unreasonable, like, we might say it's unreasonable, but if there's like a pretty like substantial like proportion of people who whether it's reasonable or not, for some reason they're inclined to think
Yeah.
this, and you even have professional philosophers saying this, like, I don't think, like, what Michael Humer says about people like live as realists. I mean, I don't think that's like reasonable at all. That's like a crazy thing to say. But it's
Oh, I'm
like,
not sure.
whether
Might be
it's
true.
reasonable or not, I mean, I think if you have people, if a good proportion of people are apt to like think that these anti-realist views like imply tolerance, I mean, I think it's still like you still have some like duty when you're talking about metaethics and talking about these views to just specify and be clear. Yeah, I know this is like a common thing that people think, um, and I know maybe it could come off that like I'm saying that I think this with this argument I'm making, but this is actually not what I'm saying. This is not true. I just want to like clear this up to like dispel any potential confusion.
Yeah. I suppose the difference there would be then that my arguments aren't the problem. That's the important difference. Because it's like, oh, hey, by the way, like all these idiots are reading your articles and getting the wrong idea. Just put like a footnote or something. It's like, yeah, good point. It's like, yeah, fine. But, I think a big part of what we were sort of concerned about together was like, oh, hey, are these arguments like, are they the problem as opposed to the audience? By the way, all my readers are not idiots. So.
Well, okay. I mean, so there's a separate kind of thing, like with what you're trying to actually like argue, whether that has an issue. Um, I mean,
Yeah.
it still seems like there's some issue. Mainly that it's not clear what the argument is even trying to say, or if it is really an argument,
But
because it
recall,
invokes things that, I'm not sure are propositional. But I mean, even if that's like there's no intent to like normatively entangle, there is this separate question, right? Of, you know, is the argument coming across as far stronger because of the normative entanglement, even if it's not intentional? And I think this happens with a lot of arguments for realism, or arguments against anti-realist positions, or like these kind of like intuition pumps and like thought experiments that people give. Like, I think a lot of these, even if it's not the intent of the realist presenting it, I think a lot of them, they come across as like artificially far stronger, than they really are, because of this like normative entanglement issue that like the audience hearing it is I would say pretty likely they're liable to misinterpret. Um,
yeah, but the thing was like whether that applied to my arguments, because obviously I agree that some arguments exist out there that do that, such as genocide argument that doesn't have the all right in there. But because I think one of my main disagreements was like, yeah, I don't think my arguments are guilty of this normative entanglement. Like that's one of the main concerns I had, and it wasn't just because I didn't intend to do it, because as I said, that wouldn't address the concern. It's like it doesn't matter what you intended here; it's about whether this is a bad argument, even if you didn't intend for it to be. But that's what I'm pushing back against. I think these arguments are fine; they get off on their own merits, and they actually prove something true. I believe they're right, and I think people will come away if they actually come to believe what the arguments say. They'll come to believe the right things about these views. But as I mentioned before, you've sort of softened me up to the idea, at least for the subjectivist argument, that's like, yeah, people have this general idea, or just, whether or not they're reasonable or not, because I actually, yeah, I think I'd say they wouldn't be very reasonable. But, that doesn't sort of dismiss the idea that I should have just like a clarifying sentence. But it does mean that my argument's not the problem. It's rather just, the folks who are reading it are misinterpreting it unfairly, which, can be true for any argument. So I think I'll put a clarifying sentence there. Which isn't to say like,
I mean, I
my
do
arguments
think
suck.
there's, well, okay. I mean, I think there's an issue with, I just think like the way the arguments are phrased, it lends itself for people to come away with this view that these anti-realist views like subjectivism entail normative implications that they don't.
So
I mean, I think there is still
Mm.
that issue of, now I don't know, like with the argument. I mean, if you want to say, it depends, I guess, what you mean by the arguments. I mean, I think the way that the premises are phrased, they're phrased in like a bad way. Let me just give you an example of like, if I were to say something like, well, if you are an anti-realist, you do not think that like torturing babies is really wrong. And you do hear like lots of realists like to say things like this. Now, if by really you just mean like stance independently, I mean, that's kind of a trivial statement. Like, yeah, of course, an anti-realist doesn't think torturing babies is going to be
First premise would be
stance
right.
independently
Yep.
wrong. But like the way the statement, so there's not really a problem, I guess, with like the proposition the statement is like expressing, because the proposition, I mean, that's clearly right. But like the way it's phrased in like a particular way, like, oh, if you're an anti-realist, you don't think this is really wrong. That like, it's like kind of phrased in like this way that like I think gives people, is very likely to give people this kind of like impression that, oh, like, or anti-realists, do they really have like, are they okay with this? Like, I don't know, it seems phrased in like a kind of like rhetorical, it seems like this kind of very rhetorical move.
And I think I'd largely agree. I would just deny that that's sort of what my arguments are. That's, that's the crucial difference. Like, I don't think that's what's going on in my arguments.
Well, I mean, I think the way they are phrased, they do just have like that issue. I mean, with the example I gave, like it could be the case that the person presenting the argument, presenting the statement, like about how anti-realists don't think anything is really wrong, I mean, they might not have any sort of like intent, right? But I think the statement, it's a problematic statement because like the way it's phrased in this like rhetorical like fashion, like I don't know, just the way it's phrased gives off these it has this kind of pragmatic like implication that anti-realists have. They're saddled with these sorts of like unsavory like normative implications, like, oh, like maybe they don't really have a problem with like baby torture, or like they think it's less bad than the realist does, or things like that.
It's interesting actually, because it seems like that premise, like the first step to making it more, to clarify what it actually means, would also have to include the all right bit. It's like, not only would they say nothing stands independently wrong, but also right. So they'd also be missing out on that bit, which, my argument doesn't do. But I think it's also going to come down to what a reasonable, like what would we expect a reasonable person to believe when someone just says like, oh, if anti-realism is true, then nothing's really wrong. It's like, I think a reasonable person will see that and be like, oh, what the arguer is saying, it's like anti-realists just can't say anything's wrong. Like, not really. It's like, oh, that's a bit misleading. And a reasonable person would seem to believe that, because they're looking at the premises. It's like, really, it's like, truly, properly, or something like that. Like, that does seem misleading. And it doesn't include the all right bit, which would, just sort of be like me arguing that, oh, if error theory is true, nothing wrong with genocide. It's like, whoa, that gives this first order moral implication that error theorists are fine with genocide when they're clearly not. So yeah, I agree that instance that you're talking about would be normative entanglement, but yeah, I think my arguments aren't like that. But at the same time, I think some folks might be unreasonable and misread, especially the rescue argument, especially because they just have these contradictory ideas about what subjectivism or relativism implies. So it's just to make sure people understand what's going on. It's just a good idea to have it there, which is fine. I agree with that.
Okay. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to discuss.
Can't really think of anything. I know I've got some cool arguments about veganism if you're interested. Maybe check those out if you're interested. But especially one about folks who say like being humans morally important in and of itself. Thought I've got a cool article on that you might like. But otherwise, yeah, I don't think I've got anything else to say. But yeah, I don't think. I guess to summarize where I've sort of come across, like I think the charge of normative entanglement is unfounded and unfair. I don't think my arguments are problematically misleading in that, a reasonable person without meta-ethical knowledge, or maybe even a little bit of meta-ethical knowledge, will be misled. And I think they get by on their own merit. But as I said, I think it's still handy to just have these sort of clarifying sentences for folks who, while unreasonable, I don't want people to come away with the wrong idea. So the problem is not my arguments, it's just, they're confused. Which is, that's fine.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't think the charge of normative entanglement was unfounded. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that like the way the arguments were phrased, they're phrased in a way that's very liable for misinterpretation, for people to come away with this impression that anti-realists are saddled with these unsavory like normative implications that they aren't. I mean, I don't know that there's much more to say on that front, because I think we're kind of just going to be saying the same things that we've already reiterated, I think, a few different times in this discussion. So we might just have to like leave it
just
there.
Replay it. Get the same response.
No, I mean, we could just be like, the next 5 hours we go and it's just we keep saying the same things over and over to each other, and then 5 hours later we're like, yeah, we're both in the same spot. So I don't know. I don't know if but yeah, I'll check those articles out that you have about
it's called Paradox and Prejudice. It should be like on the main page.
Okay, I'll look at that. I did see that you a while ago you liked one of my articles about animal ethics as well. I don't know if you wanted to, because this is kind of like a different like topic. I mean, it's meta ethics, but it's like it wasn't really discussed in our articles. Like, I don't know if you wanted, because I think you saw my video about like subjectivism and moral disagreement. I don't know if you wanted to talk
I browsed it.
Or if you just wanted to like leave it here and just just have it be about those articles that we wrote.
I mean, I'm game either way. I'm fine if you want to have it. If you want to talk about that too, so long as you've got enough time, because I know you said you might have something on at 11. But if you've got the time, that's fine. I'm happy to chat.
My schedule was kind of I had to reschedule it, but then it turned out now I do have I don't know, it's kind of like hectic, but
yeah, cool.
But yeah, I have time. Well, I don't know that there's too much to say on this, but like So with like disagreement, so I don't know how many of the people watching have seen my video on disagreement. So with that video, um, my point, there's this argument against subjectivism. It's kind of, it's called like the missing like disagreement objection or whatever. And basically the idea is, okay, if you're a subjectivist, well, the idea is like, okay, like if two people, one says abortion is wrong, one says it's permissible or whatever,
Yeah.
it seems like when they talk about that, they're disagreeing with each other. And but on subjectivism, if like moral propositions are if they're just propositions like about our attitudes, like if I'm just describing my attitudes, I'm saying, yeah, I don't really have any negative attitude towards abortion. And then the person I'm talking to, they're describing their attitudes. Yeah, well, I do have a negative attitude towards abortion. The like kind of idea of this objection is, well, we don't really disagree because, well, yeah, I agree that you disapprove of abortion and they agree that I don't disapprove of abortion. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
setting aside, there are kind of like technical like quibbles you could maybe make. You could say like, oh, well, like you might think they're like mistaken about their preferences. Like I'm setting
Yeah.
aside things like
Yeah. Of
that.
course.
And I think even like when we kind of specify, okay, well, they're not mistaken about their preferences, they're not, it's not like they have some false belief that's leading to the preferences. Even if we kind of, they're being honest about it, they're not lying, even if we kind of make all those specifications, I think it's still, I don't really see the issue because I think you can just say, yeah, we disagree. In the same way that, I mean, when we look at like other sort of normative domains, like when we talk about like music or movies or even food, um, people talk about like disagreeing there. Like people will talk about disagreeing about pizza toppings. I mean, there was some like viral tweet that said something like that I like posted on
Yeah.
Substack.
Yeah. That's all right.
So it's like, well, I mean, when people say disagreement in that context, when people say they disagree in that context, what are they saying? Do we really think they're saying, like, no, like, I think the proposition you're affirming is actually false. And I affirm the negation of this proposition. And the proposition you're talking about is like about some like stance independent gastronomic facts or like aesthetic facts. And it's like, well, no, I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's much more likely that people are just talking, especially in the case of food, like maybe like aesthetics, it's a bit more questionable. But I mean, I think like when people talk about food, I don't think you're going to find like many people who are gastronomic realists. I think if you asked people, I suspect, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but like I would
I'd be
suspect
very
they would say like,
surprised.
yeah,
I'd be very surprised.
we're talking about like our preference, like our taste preferences. And so it's like, well, if that's what they're talking about, but you still hear people just like say, like someone says, oh, pineapple on pizza is delicious. Another person says, oh, I totally disagree. Like that sounds to me like a very kind of natural, there doesn't seem anything out of the ordinary about an interaction like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
agree.
like, well, if we acknowledge, okay, people use disagreements in these other contexts, and we don't think they're talking about like contradictory beliefs, some proposition and contention between them. They're just talking about like they're just expressing that they share different preferences. It's like, why can't the subjectivist just apply the same analysis to a moral discourse? Now, by the way, just to make it clear, I mean, I kind of already did say this at some point earlier in the video, but like I'm not saying this is like the right account of moral disagreement. I'm not saying this is what people are actually doing. I'm just
Yeah. I
saying
got that.
this doesn't seem like a crazy like account of moral disagreement. So I don't really see it as, it doesn't really seem to me like really, to be honest, a problem at all for the subjectivist. this like so-called disagreement problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like obviously, like we're not going to take people saying that they disagree about something always to literally mean they disagree about something. Like people say like food disagrees with them, but presumably they're not like this food literally disagrees with me. It's like, oh, it like just makes me like stomach upset or something like that. So maybe there's a lesson to be learned there too. But I know I've always taken this as an argument against subjectivism as opposed to an argument for like in favor of moral realism directly or anything like that. It's sort of like an indirect argument, like an error theorist could use it. It's like, oh, this theory can't account for moral disagreement. That's why it sucks. But I'm putting that aside.
Well, I mean, I agree that like, yeah, sure, you could have
yeah, just because
you
it's
could
sort
be
of going
like
to
a
be
non-realist and still run it.
Yeah, it's just only that like it seems to be utilizing this sort of hinge. It's like, oh, we sort of say we disagree about food preferences, but it seems if we sort of have to take a realist account in order to maintain that'd be silly. So we should have to sort of just agree that okay, we can still actually disagree in these cases where we're just saying like, I dislike this, and the other person says, oh, I don't dislike it, or something like that. But I don't know, I think there could definitely be other accounts that might deny that there's actual disagreement there, but still account for the ordinary usage of language. Maybe like something expressivist where you sort of say you disagree, but you don't actually disagree. Like that could work, I think, perhaps. But only because like under subjectivism, like if you take like gastronomic subjectivism or something, it's like, oh, I like chocolate cake, vegan chocolate cake, of course. And someone else like, oh, but I dislike chocolate cake. It's like, it doesn't look like they're disagreeing. But then like, yeah, I'm assuming you want to come in and say like, oh no, they're still disagreeing. We're just like, what are they disagreeing about? Which is sort of why I want to say like, which is why I might favor like an expressivist account of this. It's like, oh, they say they do, but it's just the impression. They're just sort of saying like, yum, chocolate cake, or ew, chocolate cake. And they're sort of expressing it as propositions that aren't literally true. Because there's no they can talk as if realism was true, but it's not actually true about these things.
Okay, well, I wouldn't characterize it as like talking as if like realism is true. I mean, at least when I think about when I introspect on my own like language use, when talking about these sorts of domains.
It doesn't have to be, yeah. You could just be like, it'd be like the difference between like a quasi-realism for gastronomic stuff versus like an expressivism or something. It's like quasi-realism would be like, sure, yeah, we talk like this, but but the expressive would be like, whatever. We're not trying to talk like realists or something. So you can go either way, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see. I mean, someone could like offer some like alternative account of it. And I don't know, maybe like, okay, there is like, here's this account of it that is true, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like just a plain subjectivist account seems pretty plausible to me. Of like, or whatever you want to call it, ordinary gastronomic discourse or whatever. And when someone says like, I disagree, really all they're saying when they say that is, oh, I don't share that preference, or I have the opposite preference, or something like that. And it's like, to me, it seems like we can perfectly account for it that way. That seems totally fine. It seems very intuitive, at least to me. I mean, I don't know about you or other people,
but sorry to disappoint.
Yeah, well,
it's just I guess it's sort of saying like there's this disagreement going on, but I'm like, I'm not seeing the disagreement, which is sort of why I want to explain it away.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, disagreement. When you say you're not seeing the disagreement, I mean, the thing, like, disagreement is like many words, disagree, it's kind of this term that can refer to multiple different things. So, like, yes, in some circumstances, when we say disagree, we might mean, yeah, we have contradictory beliefs, maybe something like, one person thinks climate change is caused by
Yeah.
humans and the
Yeah.
other person doesn't. There then it is like a genuine, it is kind of like a clash of uh
Clash of beliefs, I suppose, in
yeah,
that
clash of
sense.
beliefs. Like they have a kind of differing, you know, um belief regarding this one proposition. There's a proposition in contention. But
Yeah.
then
They think
in
their
other
beliefs false. Yeah.
cases, we use the word disagree to mean other things. Like in the case of food, someone says pineapple on pizza is so delicious. It's the best pizza topping ever. And then someone says, "Oh, that I totally disagree. Pineapple on pizza is disgusting. It is a culinary abomination." And it's like, well, disagree in that context. I mean, it just means something different. In that context, when you say you disagree, you just mean, oh, I have a different preference than you. And it's like, that seems like fine. I don't see what the problem with the account is.
Well, I suppose it's sort of like there's no disagreement. That's my issue. It's like there's apparent disagreement at best, but there's no actual disagreement, which is why I want to go like an expressivist route or something like that. Because, like, yeah, they're saying like, I just like this, I like this, but they're not saying they're mistaken or something. But I think we can still talk about, oh, something disagrees with me, and not mean it. It's like, oh, this food disagrees with me. It gives me a stomachache. They're not literally saying the food disagrees with them. They're not even talking about disagreement at all. They're just saying, oh, it makes me feel bad or something like that. And I think we can tell a similar story for like talking about food. It's like, oh man, I love this food. Oh, I totally disagree. It's like, oh, you're just saying yum this food, and the other one's like boo this food, or something like that. And it just has the guise of propositional language. Because it'd be sort of funny if someone was to sort of put like propositions about food tasting good into like an argument and trying to argue that something's like, therefore this is tasty. It's like, that's kind of silly. But we wouldn't sort of expect that of like other facts, or maybe I guess even moral facts too.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when it comes to like whether they're actually disagreeing, I mean, to me, it seems like fine to say they're actually disagreeing. I mean, I think the issue is when you say like actually disagreeing, I mean, it's like you have this notion of disagreement that's like, okay, it refers to this, to when these people have contradictory beliefs. So that's disagreement. We can use the word disagree to refer to like other sorts of things, but like in those cases, we're not like actually disagreeing. I mean, I don't know. I don't really see the issue with saying they're actually disagreeing in that food case. We're like disagreeing. I mean, we just mean they have different preferences.
Well, I think in any case, I think a big crux of your argument was sort of relying on this idea that, oh, if your view's incorrect, like someone wants to say like we still have disagreement in these like gastronomic domains, that they're committed to like being a realist about these things. But that's what I think this other account can sort of just reject. It's just like, oh, it doesn't have to be like that. Maybe we could just explain away this disagreement. It's like there's only apparent disagreement here. We're just like sort of just saying stuff like an expressivist would, or as a quasi-realist would, if we want to say like it seems a realist, but it's not. There's no actual truths of the matter here. We say like, oh, chocolate cake's the best. It's like it's not literally true. You're just saying like yay, chocolate cake, super nice, or something like that. So I think that does take the wind out of the sails of the argument for me, because that's sort of how I was interpreting it. It's like, if we don't go this way, we have to go this way, but that's ridiculous, so we should go my way. Like, oh, but there's other ways you could go. So unless those are ruled out too, maybe we should sort of, if we really find this idea intuitive, that, moral subjectivism can't account for disagreement, which I do find intuitive. It's like, well, we can just go down this other path without having to accept like gastronomic realism, stuff like that.
Okay, well, I mean, I see it as the issue. I mean, I think this problem is like most often like applied to subjectivism. I mean, but I
Yeah,
mean, the
definitely. Yeah.
assumptions behind it, I mean, they seem to apply to certain other anti-realist views. Like the assumption behind it seems to be, like, oh, in order for there to be a disagreement, there has to be a proposition in contention. So, like, even with something like expressivism, okay, well, they're not making propositions about their attitudes, about their taste preferences. They're just saying something like, oh, yum, chocolate cake.
Yeah.
It's like,
I
well, I mean, they're
suppose.
still not, they don't have any contradictory like beliefs there.
Oh yeah. The big part about this account would be like explaining away disagreement. It'd just be explaining like, yeah, we have apparent disagreement, but in fact, there's actually no disagreement. But that's fine because we can still sort of hold on to our ordinary usage of those sort of terms. Just like how we might say like, oh man, this food disagrees with me. When I'm like, hey, I'm not really saying that, literally. I'm just sort of like, man, this food, really doesn't make me feel good. Boo this food, that sort of thing. So in that sense, you could say, yeah, I'm not explaining disagreement. I'm getting rid of it. But, I think that's probably fine, I'd say. Yeah, because, otherwise you'd be right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess I just don't share this like inclination to say, like, oh, there's no like actual disagreement. Like, I don't know, it just seems fine to me to say, yeah, there is actual disagreement, but disagreement just consists of a clash of, attitudes.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're disagreeing about. That's all. Because I really.
They're disagreeing about, well, I mean, the assumption here is that, like, in order for like two people to disagree about something, that something has to be a proposition. But like, I don't think that's how like ordinary people would talk. I think people would talk like they would say like, oh yeah, we're disagreeing about whether pineapple on pizza is tasty. And it's like, well, it's not any proposition, but like when they say that, they just mean, yeah, we have these different taste preferences when it comes to pineapple on pizza.
But I'm not seeing the disagreement. That's the thing. It's just like if they're like, maybe in like the heat of the moment, they're sort of just like yelling at each other, but then it's like, oh, you like it, and that's true. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, I'm not really sure I'm not sure that, comes back to that point again. I have no idea what they're disagreeing about. It's like, oh, okay. I agree with everything you say, but I disagree with you or something. It's like, huh? Don't understand.
Well, I mean, if someone like said, okay, we disagree, like if you saw two people like arguing like that, and then you asked them, oh, like, what are you guys disagreeing about? And then they said about whether pineapple on pizza is tasty. Like, would you be confused by that? Like, or would you understand what they mean when they say that?
Well, yeah, I'd say like this guy likes it, this guy doesn't. But I wouldn't cash it out in terms of them just saying like, as a subjectivist would. Because, as expressivist and like some sort of expressivist account could, it still makes sense. It's just like a bit weird. It's not like they're talking about like climate change or something. So it can be a perfectly natural way of talking. They're just talking in propositions that aren't literally true. It's like, oh, chocolate cake's the best. What? No, it isn't. It's like, well, this guy just likes it. This other guy doesn't. It's like that's sort of the end. And sort of there's this impression that there's some truth to it, but not really. It's like, oh, give me your argument that chocolate cake's the best or something. And I suppose some people might give those sorts of arguments in some cases, but it seems a bit silly. Here's why it's the best because it's got this ingredient and these sorts of things. that's sort of the same, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess there's not that much else to say on this front. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
just fine. I mean, I would say I'm like completely like satisfied saying like, oh, um, as someone who like uses like moral language in this subjectivist way, I'm totally fine saying like, oh, I agree, or I not I agree, I disagree with like carnists on whether it's like permissible to consume animal products. And by that, I just mean that like we share these different like attitudes towards it. I'm like totally just satisfied saying that. I'm not really bothered by, doesn't really seem to me anything problematic about like that. So I just don't see the force of the objection.
Well, I guess the objection is like it's contradictory. It's like there's saying there's a disagreement, but there isn't. That's how I'd sort of phrase it. But
Well, there's like,
clearly you're gonna just deny that. So,
yeah.
so yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. This might also, well, because it's like, I'm not, when I say there's a disagreement, I'm just talking about us having these different like attitudes. I'm not talking about a contradictory beliefs, but I mean, yeah, I guess there's not really else to say on the
Oh,
disagreement
sorry.
thing.
I should clarify. I meant like I think your view is a contradiction. That's what I sort of meant.
I'm
I
sorry, you're
meant like
saying that my view
yes, yes,
entails a contradiction, a logical contradiction.
yeah. Basically, it's like there's disagreement, but there is no disagreement. Basically, that's
Okay,
how
but
I'd
you
see
do
your view.
understand. Okay.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
going
and
to like
obviously, yeah,
run
yeah.
into like the equivocation like issue again,
No,
where it's
I don't think
like
so.
it's not an actual like proposition and negation. Like because when you say there is disagreement and there is not disagreement, that I'm affirming that contradiction. That would be a contradiction if the term disagreement referred to the same thing in like those propositions, but because it doesn't, there is no contradiction. It's like the bad example. Like if Charlie says I do and don't have a bat in my house, that would be a contradiction if like in both cases he's talking about like a baseball bat. But if like in the first proposition he's talking about a baseball bat, and in the second one he's talking about the animal, like there is no contradiction. Those statements are compatible
Uh,
with each
I
other.
think
It's the same thing here.
I think it's just going to come down to the same disagreement we had about the error theory then. So, not much else to
Yeah.
say.
Well, so like, do you take? Well, I think because this is one of the things we keep running into. Is this issue like? It's like the way I think about things is the proposition when someone like says something, when someone makes a statement, what proposition that's referring to. It depends on like the speaker intent. So if I say this is a disagreement and I am just intending to express it's a clash of attitudes, then like that's what proposition I'm affirming. It seems like you have this view where it can be like a completely different proposition than the one they were intending
Yeah,
to
that's right.
express.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'm not exactly familiar with the literature on the topic, but a friend of mine, I think he sort of referred to it as like semantic internalism versus externalism. That might be
Yeah.
what this is.
Yeah. So I
So,
think that's kind of, well,
or
that's
doing a lot of the
like the
work, yeah.
crux of like a lot of the I think issues or like disagreements that we've been having in this like conversation is just like we have like different views of like you know what it means, of meaning, I guess, because I think it's just fixed completely by the speaker. There's no real like right or wrong way to use words. So I think that's the main thing. Or I mean, there's other issues that don't rely on that, but that's like a big one. That's kind of like at the heart
Yeah,
of a
for
lot of
sure.
these issues.
But I think it's also going to have a bunch of like implications for like whether certain views are compatible with each other when they don't seem to be and stuff like that, which I was sort of talking about way earlier. Like trivializing certain meta-ethical views to the point where everyone accepts them because they're just tautological. But yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just
Anyway.
wanted to like make sure because it sounded to me like that was the sort of view you took, but I just wanted to make sure like you would sign off on that kind of.
Yeah.
Okay then.
Okay, cool. Well,
Okay.
thanks for the discussion. I guess I'll see you around
Okay.
on
Goodbye.
Substack. I suppose for anyone who's listening, subscribe to the Per Se Substack on Substack.
Yeah, I'll include a link. I'll edit
Cool.
this and put a link in the description.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay.
Cheers.
No problem. Bye.